Good morning. My name is Mel Hartley and I am the Senior Communications and Regulation Officer here at the Training Accreditation Council. And I'd like to welcome you to our new Chat with TAC webinar. And this is on the topic of amount of training. This new format 30-minute webinar is designed to offer concise and easily digestible information on trending subjects. And the way this webinar will work is it's made up of a 15-minute presentation followed by 15 minutes for questions. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box throughout the session. At this time, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on, the Whadjuk people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. And now I'd like to introduce Russell, who is our facilitator for today. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mel, and thank you very much, Mel, for setting up this new way of doing things. It's rather exciting to be involved in it. I'm not known for being concise, but I'll do my very best to deal with this issue of the amount of training in my allotted 15 minutes. But a lot depends also on you asking questions. And we did ask for questions ahead of time, and we do have some questions which we can address at the end. But your questions are most important for us to be able to make sure that we shape the outcomes of today's half hour to meet your needs. And so this session we have for you today is a presentation followed by a question time. And in the presentation, we're going to try to deal with what we see to be the most important facets of the amount of training. So first of all, it's logical that we start with what do the standards tell us about the amount of training and why is it important to calculate an amount of training. And then in terms of calculating the amount of training, what is included in that figure? And how does the amount of training differ from other indicators? Because there are a number of other indicators that they use to determine the kind of extent of training that's involved. Then we get into more precise ideas about how we calculate the amount of training, how we can manage the amount of training to keep it reasonable, and then what resources you can access. And we already have, of course, some resources for you. One of them is the session outline, which Mel has provided you a link to. And the other, of course, is the fact sheet on the amount of training. And the fact sheet on the amount of training is one that we might refer to from time to time because it does provide you with an enduring set of guidance for the amount of training as we go. So let's begin with the first question, which is, what do the standards tell us? And it's a little bit strange, but what we discover is that the amount of training is not defined in the glossary. And so we have to resort to the standards, the text of the standards and the clauses themselves. Although the context section for Standard 1 does say, the RTOs training and assessment strategies and practices must have regard to the amount of training required by the learner to gain the competencies as specified in the relevant training package or VET accredited course. The amount of training will vary depending on existing skills and knowledge of learners and the mode of delivery and include any work placement arrangements. So that we can see that in the context statement for Standard 1, kind of definition of what the amount of training is. We also see the amount of training mentioned in clause 1.1 when it basically says that you need to have planned strategies, including an appropriate amount of training to enable learners to achieve the outcomes or their objectives in undertaking the training. 1.2 gives us some more precise information because it fundamentally reminds us that the amount of training will depend on learner characteristics, that is the skills and knowledge that they bring to the learning before they arrive in your class, and the modes of delivery. And it also will, of course, if you take a whole set of learning, such as a skill set or a qualification, it will also depend on the number of units of competency that are involved. Obviously, the more units of competency, the greater the amount of training. Standard 5.2b reminds us that we need to make sure that we inform learners of RTO training and assessment services. And although it doesn't mention the amount of training, informing learners about the amount of training that they need to be committed to is part of Standard 5.2b. They need to know what they are letting themselves in for when they undertake training with you and what your reasonable expectations are of them. And so that takes us to 5.2E2, which basically says that we need to inform learners of RTO expectations and of the learners' commitments to undertaking the training. So you can see that what the standards are saying is we need to make sure students are informed about our expectations. So we need to work out what would be reasonable and proper to expect of students. So when we start thinking about then why it's important to do this calculation, it's clear that we need to make sure that there is sufficient time for each learner to achieve their goals. Now, that sufficient time is not necessarily just your time. It might also be time that you require of them. And as you'll see when we look at calculating the amount of training, that it goes beyond just the time that you commit to the learner. The second thing is that it means that the RTO makes a commitment to provide sufficient time for learning. That is, it is a promise by you that you will support ensuring that there is sufficient time for learning. And finally, there's the learner makes a commitment to set aside sufficient time for learning. So there's a kind of contractual understanding here. We will make a commitment to provide you with the opportunities for learning, and you as the student will make a commitment to set aside sufficient time for learning. And in a world of competing demands, demands that might involve such things as part-time work and family commitments, it is important that the learner understands what is needed in order for them to achieve the goals of the course or the training package or the training product that they're enrolling in. When it comes to looking at what's included in the amount of training, we can see that there are a number of components, but these are all required or structured aspects of learning. So clearly formal contact, face-to-face or online involvement or engagement clearly is a commitment that the student needs to be able to make and that you need to provide. Workshop or workplace hours, particularly where those workplace hours are structured. That is, you are asking to do something particular and specific in the workplace for a particular unit of competency or a particular assessment activity. Required preparation or follow-up activities. Notice the word required there, which is basically saying it's not just what they might do out of interest, it's where you specify that they must do some preparation or they must follow up some session with particular activities. Formative assessment, it definitely is going to be part of the amount of training because formative assessment is part of that process of acquiring competence. Summative assessment has a question mark after it because you can include it. Some people think of summative assessment, that is the assessments through which you judge competence, as being part of achieving learning outcomes. And others say, well, summative assessment is not part of learning, it's something else. I would argue that if you include summative assessment in the figure for amount of training, then you will have told the student the whole story about what they have to set aside in terms of time. If you don't include summative assessment in the amount of training, then I would argue you need to tell them that and say, in addition to this amount of training, there are assessment times that you need to set aside. So at some point or other, you need to make sure the student is aware that assessment is a requirement of achieving the outcomes, and either you include it in the amount of training or you don't, but then add another statement which says there is an assessment requirement over and above this amount of training. So what is not included is private study, previous learning, workplace experience. And I want to draw a distinction there between sort of unstructured workplace experience, such as an apprenticeship, where most of the training and most of the workplace activity, I should say, is unstructured. It contributes to training, but it's not structured by you. But within that period of time in the workplace, you might ask them to do things, and those things would become part of the amount of training. You would need to calculate and estimate what sort of time was involved. It's also important to recognise that the amount of training is different to most of the other metrics that we use to indicate what's involved in a course of study. So you will know of nominal hours, and nominal hours is basically formal contact time, which involves a particular cost for you. So it mainly involves formal contact time where the lecturer, the trainer or assessor is involved in dealing with the student. And so nominal hours is a statement that is less than the amount of training, because the amount of training also includes things that they do under your requirements, but not under your personal supervision and supervision. A duration is a statement which says the course begins here and ends there. It's the span of time, but they might be doing quite a number of different things in that time. So the duration is simply a period of time within which the learning will occur, but it is not a metric of the actual amount of hours that a person needs to commit. During the duration time is all sorts of other things happening other than learning. Workplace immersion, such as a period of time working within or operating within a workplace, it might say they have to spend 120 hours. There may be no unit of competency attached to that 120 hours. What's happening there is that 120 hours is simply experiential. It's to get them used to the idea of a workplace. It's not used for formal training or structured training. It maybe not be used for assessment, in which case it doesn't count. On the other hand, if that 120 hours is associated with a particular unit of competency and it becomes part of the formal learning process and it does involve carrying out assessments and observations, then that 120 hours would count into the amount of training. So you need to think about whether it's workplace immersion or whether it's workplace training as such. And then, of course, volume of learning. People often get volume of learning and amount of training mixed up. Volume of learning is a very gross indicator of the amount of learning that it takes to get to a particular point in a qualification or to complete a qualification. So it's a very gross kind of figure that is used by accrediting authorities such as TAC and ASQA to determine whether or not a Certificate 2 should be a Certificate 2, or whether it should be a Certificate 3, or whether it should be a Certificate 1, and whether a sufficient volume of learning is associated with it. So the volume of learning is part of the process of getting a course recognised in terms of its AQF level. It's not something that directly impacts on you as a trainer and assessor. What impacts on you as a trainer and assessor is the amount of training. And so we need to now look at how we calculate. When we look at how we calculate the amount of training, we need to consider a number of aspects, because what we're trying to do is to determine the number of hours a typical learner, and I realise that straight away throws us into a world of subjectivity, but don't panic, because it's not so much the number you arrive at, but the thought processes through which you arrive at the number. So you need to imagine a typical learner for a particular cohort. Consider the mode of delivery you're using. Is it face-to-face? Is it online? Is it a hybrid or blended system? You might need to think about sort of typical hours that are involved for a particular learning activity, such as doing an assignment or doing a project or in the workshop or laboratory. And then basically say, well, this is the kind of hours that a typical learner would require. It's not going to be a precise figure. What it's going to be is a notional figure based on your experience of that cohort of learners. And if you have different cohorts of learners, there will be different amounts of training. So if you're delivering to a group of experienced learners, then they will require less hours. So for experienced learners, you can say, well, the typical learner will take this many hours, but an experienced learner will take less. Or you might find that there's going to need to be increased hours for learners for whom what you're providing is new, or for whom the process of acquiring the skills is going to be a challenge. So what you need to think about there is not just what is a typical learner, but what sort of variations might be involved. And if those variations are significant, such as you need for a particular cohort a different mode of delivery and significant difference in hours, you might in fact create different training and assessment strategies for those different cohorts. Rather than having one training and assessment strategy with variations, you might find it more meaningful to have different training and assessment strategies for different cohorts and different modes of delivery. It's no hard line rule on that. It's just what works for you. When it comes to thinking about the amount of training, you need to recognise that you can vary it. You may discover that you were wrong in your calculation, that your estimation was a bit off, in which case you can modify the amount of training. You can increase it if you find it's more demanding. You can decrease it if you find that it is easier for them to acquire. Or you might find that through clustering, you can reduce the amount of time that's involved. And under those circumstances, you can say, well, instead of duplicating this training, we can, through clustering, reduce the amount of training. And that's good for you as an RTO and good for the students. And you can also control it through selective entry and delivery modes. You might say, well, we cannot support this amount of training, so if we take a typical student, so we're going to need to have atypical students. We're going to offer our training to maybe experienced students only. Or you may be deciding that you are going to be an organisation that provides training for people who have struggled perhaps through school, in which case you will manage that by increasing the amount of training and perhaps modifying your delivery modes. So it needs to be understood that what happens as you go is that you can build an amount of training which will reflect your student cohort, select your delivery, reflect the objectives of your organisation. It's never going to be hard and fast. It's never going to be fixed and nailed down. What it's going to be is a statement which is where you say, we believe this is the amount of effort that you need to put in. This is the amount of mind time, is the way I often think about it, that you need to commit to our training. We'll support you through that process so you can achieve the outcomes. But we are learners like our students, and we may learn that we need to make changes, and that's perfectly legitimate to do so. There are lots of resources you can access to look at this in more detail. There are, of course, the standards for RTOs. There is the TAC Users Guide, and, of course, the TAC fact sheet. But what I've tried to do in that time, and I've run over by 3 minutes, I apologise for that, but we need to consider some questions that you might have. And there were some questions that we were looking at before this session. The first one I want to raise is, why don't training packages specify the amount of training for a qualification? Wouldn't it be a good idea if training packages said this is the amount of training and you have to work to it? The problem is that our concept of competency and of vocational education and training is outcome-driven, not input-driven. So we basically now understand that we need consistent outcomes, which are the competency standards. And to achieve consistent outcomes, we have to have variable inputs. So some students will need more time, some students will need less time, and under those circumstances, it's impossible for anyone to say this is the actual exact amount of training. So different amounts of training will be needed, and so that puts it back onto your shoulders to work out what's involved. So when an auditor, and this was the next question, what are auditors looking for when they audit the amount of training? An auditor is not going to be looking at the actual number so much as looking at how you got to the actual number. So they want to see what sort of analysis have you done, what sort of thinking have you done to work out what a typical learner would need in terms of hours for a particular cohort of students and a particular mode of delivery. And that's normally done by you calculating that for each unit or for each cluster, and then adding it across the skill set or adding across the cluster, or adding across the qualification. So it's not about the number so much as about the thought that you've put into it. And can you change the amount of training? Yes, of course you can. So we would actually, as auditors, be pleased to see that you modified the amount of training, because that would show that you were thinking and observing and monitoring how the amount of training you allocated was working. And it's a good thing to see that the amount of training has been adjusted. So it's not going to be an exact number. It's not going to be a fixed number. It's always going to be an estimate, and it's always going to be indicative. But it does constitute a number which helps you as an organisation feel confident that you're going to provide enough structured learning opportunities for students to achieve. And it'll give assurance to the students that you have thought this through, and they understand their commitments. And for that matter, it'll give assurance to the accrediting authorities that you as an RTO are taking this process seriously in terms of how you are managing and receiving and providing for the learners. That's going to be important because there is always competitive pressure on RTOs to reduce the amount of training in order to be able to offer shorter and cheaper courses. And part of the purpose of the amount of training is to try to make sure that that doesn't become an endless cycle of reduction to the detriment of standards and of learners and of industry. So the amount of training is kind of assurance that there is that sort of commitment for quality provided by time. So we've got some questions here, and the first one of the questions here is a lot of debate on the nominal hour figure and the role it plays. I have to say that my understanding is that the nominal hours is determined in a kind of abstract sense. It is partly there for funding, and it is partly there for an RTO to understand what sort of resources it needs to commit of itself. So the amount of training is quite different because that incorporates not just the commitment of the organisation, but the commitment of the student. So what you can, of course, do if you're challenged by nominal hours is move more of the responsibility to the student by providing them with more structured, unsupervised activities. That means that you are able to move more of the responsibility, particularly with Certificate 3s and above. Certificate 1s and 2s need a lot more hand-holding, but Certificate 3s and beyond are probably going to be able to be much more autonomous in their learning practices, in which case nominal hours becomes less of a critical issue. Molly Morgan asks, how can an RTO who offers a Certificate 4 justify their amount of training for a 2-week fast-paced course when the typical duration is 18 months? And Molly, that's a very good question. And the answer might be that they can't justify it, or they can because they're taking on board very experienced learners. So you have to look very closely at the cohort. I remember conducting an audit very many years ago of an organisation that appeared to be delivering training exceptionally fast in an area of electrotechnology, and it turned out that all of its students had to be qualified electricians, which meant that really all it was doing was providing a kind of refresher course and a slight redirection to a particular set of skills. But on the most part, they already had the skills. And so a novice coming into that training would require a significant amount of time, but an experienced person, in this particular case qualified electricians and experienced electricians, would find that the course time needed, the amount of training needed, was very much less. So you have to go back to the question of who is the cohort of students. You have to also consider what is the mode of delivery. And so if, for example, the fast-paced course is one that is only available for experienced students, then you can, in a sense, count in the 18 months the experience that they bring to the course beforehand. Libby Calabro says, I have recently heard of a basic rigging course being offered as a one-day course. This would traditionally be 4 or 5 days due to the complexities and the high-risk work licence assessment requirements. How do we stop this, and how is it being governed? It's a very good question again, Libby. Again, I would argue that if the individuals undertaking the course were experienced, I don't think a one-day course would still do it, but you might be able to bring it back from 4 or 5 days a bit. How is it being policed? I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, Mel, but my understanding is you would have to make a complaint and raise it with TAC so that it could be viewed. It's certainly not something that we as auditors can respond to. We have to respond only at the requirements of TAC. So you could raise it with TAC if it was an issue of concern. And of course, as you know, with the high-risk work licenses, we do from time to time conduct strategic audits because there are concerns about the ever-diminishing time to training because of competitive pressures. And where we see training not committing sufficient amount of training, then action is definitely taken. We have to go back to that notion of cohort, of mode of delivery, and experience that people might already have. And of course, there's the question too of whether it's training that they're doing on the campus or training that they're doing in the workplace. So quite often training in the workplace involves a different amount of training because the people are already immersed in the workplace and are getting experiences that are relevant to the outcomes. Now, Sharon's question, I must say I've missed it. So is there a way in which I can see that one again? Where is it? Oh, okay. There are a number of, well, I'll pick up Ian Bodges because I can see that one. There are a number of large mining companies, excuse me, talking about reducing apprentices down to 2 years from 4. And what are my thoughts? For a start, we need to remember that that an apprenticeship is a training contract between that involves both employment and training, and the training is only a small part of the total contract. So the 2 years may not be a diminishment of the training; it may be a diminishment of the employment component. Now, that's not a question that is dealt with in the vet sector in terms of training products, because the training product for the particular apprenticeship might still be delivered in full. What might be reduced is the employment component, and that's a matter that lies outside the vet sector. That's more in the area of industry's requirements rather than training requirements. And of course, we have had circumstances in the past where apprenticeships have been cut back in order to increase the mobility and supply of expertise in particular areas, including, I must say, mining. So the question really is, what are you cutting back on? If you're cutting back on the employment component, that's someone else's issue. If you're cutting back on the training component, then we'd be really concerned about that from a quality training product point of view. Sharon's question is that, and I'm reading it, so I don't know what I'm going to read. The TAC fact sheet states, the training and accreditation considers assessment is part of training when assessment and learning is integrated. That's true. Look, I understand what you're getting at, and I touched on this before. Fundamentally, my personal opinion is that assessment should be included in the amount of training because that tells the student this is how much time we need you to commit. But it is not a requirement. There's no definition in the standards of what the amount of training includes or does not include. And under those circumstances, you could argue that training and assessment are two different things. If you're saying that, then fine, I'm happy with that. Then you would report your amount of training without assessment. But then I think you wouldn't need to say what was involved in assessment, because otherwise you are deluding the students into thinking that all they need to set aside is the time to learn. They also need to set aside the time to be assessed. So either you incorporate it in the total, which is my preferred option, but it's only my preference, and as an auditor, it's not for me to utilise that preference in my judgments. All my observations. But if you don't include it in the assessment in the amount of training, then you certainly do need to say, particularly in, say, a delivery and assessment plan, to the students, this is what's involved in assessment, because sometimes assessment can be significant amount of time. It can be quite drawn out. It can involve such things as travel, and it can involve things like equipment and PPE and so on. So there are aspects of assessment that are going to be a challenge for some students. They need to know about that ahead of time. They mustn't discover that late in the piece. So under standard 5.1 and 5.2, I would think you would need to, if you were separating the two, I would think you would need to say, this is the amount of time for learning and this is the amount of time for assessment, or you could say, this is the total amount of time we expect. So I'm comfortable about either one, and as an auditor, as long as what you are doing under Standard 5 is informing the student fully about the commitments of time that they need to make, then you've done your job really well. It's just that it would be nice if we had some consistency on this, but again, different RTOs like to do things in different ways, and we're very comfortable with that, so long as the ultimate outcomes are achieved. So hopefully that's answered your question. In a sense, what I'm saying is that there isn't a definitive answer to that. The question goes back to says, do you think we are blurring the boundaries between learning and summative assessment if we include summative assessment in the amount of training? I think, we learn from assessment. Preparation, for example, for summative assessment is part of learning because through that preparation you learn more. So it's very difficult to draw a hard line between the two. But it is important that the student know the whole story. And indeed, that's where we go with this exercise. And if you have further questions, please feel free to raise them with TAC. We've consumed our allotted half hour. I hope you found that useful. We love to hear from you, and we learn from your questions and your concerns and the issues. And so please provide us with feedback. And Mel has provided you with links for feedback, and there's also this QR code on your screen as we speak. So thank you very much for being with us this morning. Really nice to be with you, and all the best with your amount of training deliberations. Bye-bye now.